I have told this story to no one. Not to the hands who worked that winter at Callum Station, not to the circuit preacher who married us in April, not even to Nora herself. Not all of it, not the parts that still put a cold weight in my chest when I think on them. But I am old now, and the things a man carries get heavier with the years, and I think maybe the telling will lighten the load some. My name is Cole Drennan. I came into this world in Missouri, and I have done most of my living in Wyoming, Colorado, and the hard country in between. I was not a good man for a long stretch of my life. I want to be plain about that from the start, because what happened at Callum Station in the autumn and winter of 1881 does not make sense unless you understand what kind of man rode up to that door, and what he had done to earn the look on Nora Callum's face when she opened it. I had ridden for hire, not the law's kind of hire, the kind that comes in envelopes with no return address and pays in coin that doesn't shine as bright as it ought to. I was good at it. I was fast and I was cold, and I did not ask many questions about the men I was pointed toward. That was the Cole Drennan who left Nora Callum standing on her father's porch in the summer of 1866, 15 years before I rode back. Left her with nothing but a letter I wrote at the Laramie Post, and a silence that lasted until I finally ran out of places to be that weren't her. She had written to me once, 2 months after I left. A single page. I still have it. I will not say what it says because those words belong only to us, but I will say that I did not deserve them and I knew it, and I wrote back anyway and kept writing once a year, sometimes twice, never knowing if she read them or burned them or handed them to her father to throw in the stove. She never answered. Not once in 15 years. I kept writing because the alternative was pretending she didn't exist, and I could not manage that. I rode into Callum Station on a Tuesday in late September of 1881. The light was going amber and long across the high plain, the kind of light that makes the Wyoming grass look like it's burning from the inside. The relay station sat where it had always sat, low against the wind with its back to a limestone ridge, the main house and the barn and the stock corral and the little bunkhouse for the swing team drivers. Her father, Eli Callum, had built it in 1858. He had been dead 3 years by then. I had heard that from a drover in Rawlins who didn't know I had a reason to care. I sat my horse at the gate for a moment before I opened it. I was riding a bay gelding with a white sock on his left rear foot and a disposition that was better than mine. I had $40 in my coat pocket and a bedroll behind the saddle and a Winchester in the scabbard and nothing else of particular value. I was 47 years old and my back hurt in the mornings, and I had not done hired work in 4 years. I was trying very hard to be a different kind of man than the one I had been, and it was going tolerably well, and I had ridden 300 miles to stand at this gate and find out if any of it was worth anything. I got down, opened the gate, led the bay through, closed it behind me, walked him to the hitching rail outside the main house, tied him, stood there. The door opened before I knocked. Nora Callum stood in the doorframe with the lamplight at her back. She was 43 years old and she looked it, not in a way that diminished her, but in the way that the high plains ages a person who has worked hard and lived honestly and faced things head-on. Her hair was dark with threads of silver at the temples. Her face was weathered and fine-boned, and her eyes were the same gray they had always been, the color of the sky just before snow. She was wearing a plain dark wool dress, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and she had flour on one wrist from whatever she had been doing in the kitchen before she heard my horse come through the gate. She looked at me for a long moment. I did not speak. I had rehearsed things to say on the long ride up from Rawlins, and every one of them was worthless, and I knew it standing there in front of her. She said Cole Drennan. Not a question, not a greeting, just the name, the way you say a fact you have known for a long time and are not surprised to see confirmed. I said Nora. She looked at me another moment. Then she looked past me at the bay gelding at the hitching rail, and at the empty plain behind me going dark in the October dusk, and back at me. Barn's open, she said. Stalls empty on the south end, there's hay. She went back inside and closed the door. I bedded the bay down and spread my bedroll in the empty stall next to his and lay there in the dark listening to the wind work at the eaves of the barn and thinking that she had not told me to leave. I was 47 years old, and that felt like enough for one day. She fed me breakfast in the morning, not because she was glad to see me, I want to be clear about that, but because Nora Callum had been raised by a man who believed that whatever a person's failings, you did not let them go hungry off your place if you could help it. Eli Callum had been a hard man in most respects, but he had held to that, and his daughter held to it after him. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and something with salt pork in it. I sat at the plank table where I had sat 15 years before, and she set a plate in front of me without ceremony and poured coffee into a tin cup and sat across from me with her own cup and watched me eat with those gray eyes that gave nothing away. "You look older," she said. "I am older," I said. "You look tired." "I'm that too." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "You passing through or staying?" I looked up at her. "That depends on you." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "I've got 4 horses that need the winter work feet need seeing to, 2 of them need rebreaking after the summer range. I've got fence along the north quarter that wants 2 weeks of work before the ground freezes. And I've got a stack of harness in the barn that's been waiting since August because I haven't had a hand worth trusting to do it right." She took a drink of her coffee. 50 cents a day and your meals in the stall," she said. "Same as I'd pay any man." I said, "That's fair." She nodded. She got up and took her cup to the stove, and that was the end of the negotiation. I want to tell you what kind of woman Nora Callum was, because the word stubborn doesn't reach it, and capable is too thin a word for what she had built and maintained alone. Eli had left her the relay station and a small cattle operation, and $600 in a coffee tin buried under the kitchen floor, and she had taken all 3 and built them into something solid. The relay contract with the stage line was still running. The cattle herd had grown from 40 head to nearly 120. The buildings were in better repair than they had been when Eli was alive. She had done all of it by hiring good hands when she could find them, by doing the work herself when she couldn't, and by being harder to push around than any of the cattlemen along the Sweetwater who had, at various times over 15 years, made efforts to acquire her water rights, her grazing leases, and her relay contract through means that ranged from low offers to outright intimidation. She had sent every one of them away. I learned most of this from the only permanent hand she kept, an older man named Burl Fetters who had worked for Eli and stayed on after. Burl was 60 and walked with a hitch in his right leg from an old horse fall and had a face like a piece of dried rawhide and not many words to spare. He told me what I needed to know about the station's operation on my first morning, matter-of-factly, the way you brief a new man on his work. He did not ask who I was or what my history with Nora was. I respected that. The fence work was real work. The Wyoming autumn turned hard in the first week of October, the wind coming down off the ridge with a bite in it that got into your hands no matter how good your gloves were. I worked the north quarter fence line from first light to last, pulling wire, resetting posts where the frost heave had worked them loose, patching the places where the summer cattle had leaned on it. I did not do it quickly because it wasn't work that rewarded quick. I did it right, the way Eli Callum's fence deserved to be done, and at the end of each day I came in with my hands raw and my back telling me about every one of my 47 years, and Burl or Nora set food on the table and I ate, and said what needed saying about the next day's work and nothing else. She watched me. Not obviously, not the way you watch a man you don't trust, but she paid attention. I noticed that. I noticed when she noticed that the south gate latch I had fixed without being asked was fixed, and when she walked the fence line on the 4th day and came back without comment, which was its own kind of comment. I did not push. I had no right to push. I had left 15 years ago, and whatever claim I might once have had on her patience or her warmth I had spent a long time ago, and the only currency I had now was work done honestly and a mouth kept shut, except when there was something worth saying. The harness work took me the better part of 3 weeks, spread across the mornings before the fence work and the evenings after. There was a full set of swing team harness that wanted stitching and oiling, 2 collars that had cracked at the hames and needed rebuilding, and a tangle of lines and traces that someone had put away wet and kinked into a state that required patience I was not sure I had. I sat in the barn on a nail keg with a harness needle and a palm pad, and went at it the way my father had taught me, slow and tight, the way stitching holds. Nora came into the barn one evening near the end of October. I was working on the last collar by lantern light. She had a cup of coffee, and she set it on the bench beside me without comment and stood watching my hands for a moment. "My father taught you that?" she said. "He did," I said. Eli Callum had been the one who showed me the right way to stitch harness, back in 1864 when I was working for him as a hired hand, and had not yet gotten into the kind of work that followed. He had been patient about it. I had not deserved his patience either. Nora watched a moment more. Then she said, "He always said you had good hands." I kept stitching. After a moment I said, "He was a better judge of a man's hands than of the rest of him." She was quiet, then she said, "Maybe." She left without taking the coffee cup back, which meant I could keep it, which was, from Nora Callum in those first weeks, something close to warmth. November came and the plains went the color of old bone, and the wind stopped playing and got serious. We brought the cattle in from the north pasture in the first week of November, Burl and me and Nora riding the cut together, working the draw below the limestone ridge where the strays always pushed when the weather changed. Nora rode like she had grown up on a horse, which she had, and she worked cattle with the same economy of motion she brought to everything. No wasted movement, no noise that didn't need to be made, the horse doing what she asked before she had finished asking. We got them in by mid-afternoon. The temperature was dropping and the sky had gone a uniform gray that meant business. Burl went to feed the relay stock. Nora and I unsaddled in the barn together, working side by side in the way of people who have done shared physical work and found a rhythm in it. She said, not looking up from unbuckling her cinch, "There's a grave on the ridge, north side where the limestone breaks. You know whose it is." "I know," I said. She had buried a child. I had heard that too, in Rawlins, a son, born in 1869 and dead of fever before his 2nd birthday. The child's father was not a man I had ever met, and I did not know much about him except that he was gone by the time the child died and that Nora had buried the boy alone. I did not know what to say to that. I had thought about it on the ride up from Rawlins, and I had no words for it that weren't too small, so I said the only honest thing I had. "I'm sorry, Nora." She didn't answer right away. She pulled the saddle off her horse and set it on the rack and ran a hand down the horse's back, checking for heat. "I go up there sometimes," she said, "when it's not frozen." "I'd like to go up there," I said, "if that's all right." She looked at me across the back of her horse. Her face in the dim barn light was unreadable, or maybe I had just forgotten how to read it. Then she said, "In the spring, when the ground's decent." "All right," I said. That was all. We finished with the horses and went in out of the cold, and that night the first real snow of the season came down off the ridge and covered everything. Winter at Callum Station settled into a routine that suited me better than I would have expected, given that I had spent 15 years moving and never staying anywhere long enough to know what routine felt like. The relay work picked up a little in November as the stage company pushed its schedule before the hard freeze, and Burl and I handled the swing team changes and the horse care, which was steady and physical and required enough attention to keep the mind occupied. The cattle wanted daily checking for ice in the water troughs, and in bad weather we fed from the hay they'd put up over the summer, good hay. Nora had bought it right. In the evenings, I worked in the barn on whatever needed working on, and Nora sat in the main house by the stove with her ledgers or her mending, and Burl went to bed early the way old men do. Some evenings she left the kitchen door unlatched. Not open, just unlatched, so that when I came in off the cold and tried the handle it gave, and I would let myself in and sit across from her at the kitchen table with the stove ticking between us, and we would talk. Not about the 15 years, not about what I had been or what I had done, about the station, about the cattle, about a fence problem I had noticed or a relay horse that was going slightly off in one foreleg. Practical things. The conversation of two people who are working the same piece of ground and have things to report to each other. But sometimes the conversation drifted past the practical. She told me about her father's last years, how he had gone slowly, the way men do when the work gets ahead of them and they won't admit it, and how she had managed the gradual handover without letting him know that was what it was. She told me about a drought in '77 that had nearly taken the cattle operation, and what she had done to come through it. She told me about a neighboring rancher who had offered to buy her out 3 times in 5 years, and how she had answered him the 3rd time in terms that had apparently been sufficient, because he had not been back. She did not tell me about the child's father, and I did not ask. I told her about the 4 years since I had stopped the work I used to do, about a small horse operation in Colorado that had employed me for 2 seasons and treated me decently, about a winter I had spent helping a family outside of Cheyenne make it through a bad season, a widow with 3 sons and more cattle than she could manage, and I had stayed and worked and asked nothing for it except my meals and a corner of the barn. And in the spring I had ridden on because there was nothing for me there but the satisfaction of having been useful. I told her this not to make myself sound better than I was, but because it was what I had been doing and it was honest. She listened to all of it without speaking. When I was done, she looked at me across the table for a moment, and then she said, "You kept writing." "I did," I said. "Why?" I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Because you were the only person I had ever met who knew what I was and thought I might be something better, and I couldn't make myself let go of that, even when I didn't deserve to hold it." She looked at the stove, a long silence. "I read every letter," she said. "I hadn't known that, I had hoped it, but I hadn't known." "I didn't answer," she said, "because I didn't know what to say to a man living the way you were living. And then after a while I didn't answer because I was angry. And then after a longer while I didn't answer because I didn't know how to anymore." She folded her hands on the table. "I kept them," she said, "all of them. They're in a tin box under the bed." I sat with that for a while. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind worked at the corner of the house, with a sound like something searching for a way in. "I'm not that man anymore," I said. "I don't say that to ask you for anything. I just want you to know it." "I know," she said quietly. "I've been watching you for 2 months." December passed slow and white. The days were short and the cold was the particular Wyoming cold that gets into the bones and stays, and the work was harder for it. Frozen latches, frozen water, horses that didn't want to stand still in the stock pen while you checked their feet, the daily small contest between what needed doing and what the weather allowed. Burl fell on the icy path between the barn and the bunkhouse in the 2nd week of December and wrenched his bad knee, and for 10 days he couldn't put full weight on it. He was furious about this in the silent way of old men who hate being unable. I took over his morning chores without comment and left him to manage the harness room from a stool, which gave him something to oversee and kept him from feeling useless. Nora came out to help with the swing team change on a Tuesday morning during those 10 days, when the stage was running late and we were short-handed. She could handle a relay hitch as well as any man on the line, faster than most, And we did the change together in the cold with the stage driver stamping his feet on the box and the horses blowing steam and wanting to move. We got it done in good time and the stage pulled out and she walked back to the barn beside me and said nothing. But the shape of her silence was different from the shape it had been in September when I rode in. That is the only way I know to say it. I said, "You're good at this." She said, "I've had 15 years of practice." The way she said it was not bitter. It was just the truth, stated plainly, the way she stated most truths. But it put the 15 years between us for a moment, and I felt the weight of them. "I know," I said. "I know you didn't need me to come back." She stopped walking. We were at the barn door. She turned and looked at me. "No," she said, "I didn't need you to." A pause. The cold light off the snow made her face very clear, every line of it. "But I kept the letters," she said. She went inside. I stood in the cold for a moment with my hands in my coat pockets, looking at the closed barn door. Then I went in after her because there was work to do and because that was all I was going to get from her today, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Christmas came and went quietly. Nora made a meal with salt pork and dried beans and a dried apple pie that was better than it had any right to be, given what she had to work with. Burl ate with us at the kitchen table, which was his custom on holidays, and we sat around after with our coffee and didn't say much, which was also the custom. She had put a candle in the window. That was the only concession to the occasion that the house made, but it lit up the frost on the pane in a way that was, for a minute, genuinely beautiful. I had nothing to give her. I want to be honest about that. I had thought about it and I had $40 and I did not know what she would want and I was afraid of getting it wrong, so I had put the thought aside and waited. After Burl went to the bunkhouse that night, I sat at the kitchen table and she sat across from me as usual, and after a while I said, "I'd like to stay." She looked up from her coffee. "Past winter," I said. "If there's work and if you'll have me, I'd like to stay on." She was quiet a long time. The stove made its small sounds. The candle in the window had burned down to a stub, and the light had gone orange and low. "You're asking me," she said. "Yes." "Not telling me you're staying, asking." "Yes." She looked at the candle. "Cole Drennan," she said slowly, the way she had said it that first evening in the doorframe. "You rode out of my life when you were 32 years old with a letter and a horse and nothing else, and I spent the better part of a decade being angry at you, and the better part of another decade being something else that I don't have a clean word for. And then you rode back in September with $40 and a bedroll, and tied your horse to my hitching rail like no time had passed at all." I waited. "You fixed my gate latch," she said, "without being asked." "It was loose," I said. "I know it was loose," she said. "I'd been meaning to fix it for 2 months." She looked at me. "You rebuilt my collars. You stitched my harness like my father taught you. You worked Burl's chores when he was laid up and never once made him feel the charity of it. You told me the truth about what you'd been, which I already knew, and the truth about what you've been trying to be, which I was less sure of." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "I've been watching you for 4 months, Cole. I'm not a woman who misses much." "I know you're not," I said. She was quiet a moment longer, then she said, "You can stay." Just that, 2 words. But from Nora Callum, who gave nothing she did not mean, those 2 words were the whole of it. I let out a breath I had been holding for somewhere between 4 months and 15 years. "Thank you," I said. She got up and put more wood in the stove and set the coffee pot back on the heat and sat back down, and we talked until the candle burned out, about nothing in particular, about the fence work needed in the spring and the question of adding a few more head to the cattle operation, and whether the stage company was going to renew the relay contract on decent terms. Practical things. The conversation of 2 people who are going to be working the same piece of ground for a long time, and have a great deal to plan. January was the hardest month. It always is in Wyoming. The cold settled in with a kind of permanent authority. the thermometer dropping to figures that made the work painful and the horses reluctant, and the water troughs a constant battle. There were 3 days in the second week where the temperature did not rise above zero, and the wind came straight down off the continental divide and did not apologize for itself. On the worst of those days, I came in from the stock work with my hands so cold I couldn't feel the fingertips, and Nora without comment took both my hands in both of hers and held them in the kitchen near the stove until the feeling came back, and neither one of us said anything about it. When the feeling came back, she let go and went back to the stove, and that was all. But I thought about it the rest of that day. Burl's knee had come right by then, and he was back on his full work, and he watched all of this with the expression of a man who had seen enough of the world to know what he was looking at and had the sense not to say so. He was a good man, Burl Fetters. I was glad he was there. Nora and I had found by January what I think of as our register, the particular pitch of conversation and silence and shared work that fitted us. We had always had something like it, back in 1864 and 65 when I worked for her father, and she was a young woman learning to run the station. But it was different now. Then it had been new and charged and uncertain. Now it was something that had been tested by 15 years of absence and come back harder than it started. She did not sentimentalize it. That was not her nature. She did not in those weeks say much about the 15 years directly, not about the anger, not about the child she had buried on the ridge, not about whatever had passed in the years between. She processed those things in her own way, privately, the way she processed most things. What she gave me instead was her daily company, her trust in my work, and the unlocked kitchen door. That was more than I had any right to expect. I treated it accordingly. In February, she let me into the main house proper. Not as an event, not with ceremony. She simply, one evening, did not stop at the kitchen. She went into the main room and sat in the chair by the window with her mending, and after a moment said, without looking up, "There's a good chair by the stove in here. No reason to sit in the kitchen." I sat in the chair by the stove. The main room held the things she had chosen to keep close. Eli's old rifle on the pegs above the mantel, a photograph of her father in a case on the shelf, a small painting of the Wyoming plain in summer that someone had given her, and that she clearly valued for reasons she hadn't shared with anyone. A wooden trunk at the foot of the stairs, latched. A Bible on the side table with a ribbon marker in it. I did not ask about any of it. I sat and she mended, and outside the wind made its February argument with the ridge, and the stove was warm, and it was as quiet and good a thing as I had experienced in a long time. After an hour she looked up from her mending and said, "The tin box is in the trunk." I looked at her. "With the letters," she said. I didn't say anything. "I looked at them again last week," she said, "all of them." She looked back at her work. "You wrote well, better than I expected." "I had something to say," I said. "Yes," she said, "you did." She set the mending down on her knee and looked at the window, at the dark and the frost on the glass. "I'm not the same woman who stood on that porch in 1866, she said. "I want you to know that. I am not going to be that woman again, and I don't want you to be waiting for her." "I'm not," I said. "I didn't come back for her, I came back for you." She looked at me. Her face in the lamplight was serious and clear and without pretense. "The man who left," she said, "is he gone?" "Yes," I said. "Mostly." I said mostly because I owed her the truth of it. There were things in me that didn't fully go away. The cold that could come over me sometimes, the old instinct toward violence that I had learned to walk away from and would have to keep walking away from. She deserved to know that it was work and not settled, and that I was committed to the work. She looked at me for a long moment with those gray eyes that missed nothing. "Mostly is honest," she said. "I'll take mostly." She picked up her mending and went back to it, and the stove ticked, and the wind ran itself against the ridge, and I sat in the chair by the fire in Nora Callum's house and felt, for the first time in as long as I could honestly remember, that I was somewhere I was supposed to be. March came in like it had a grievance, hard and wet, the snow going heavy and saturated and the mud underneath it by the middle of the month beginning to assert itself. That first mud was a relief, because mud meant the ground was thinking about spring, and spring at Callum Station meant the long work of the year beginning again. The cattle turned out, the fence walking, the relay line at full schedule, the whole operation shifting into its productive season. I was part of that operation by then, not as a hired hand or not only as one. Nora had said nothing formal about it, but there was a quality to how she included me in the decisions about the spring work. The conversation about the cattle numbers, the discussion of whether to renegotiate the relay contract or run it another year as written, that was different from how you talk to a man you're paying by the day. It was the way you talk to a partner. Burl noticed. I think Burl had been waiting for it. He was a careful man and he said nothing, but there was a quality to how he distributed the work in March that left Nora and me working together more often than the task strictly required, and I thought about telling him I had noticed, but I decided to let the old man have his satisfaction in peace. One evening in the last week of March, with the snow mostly gone from the south-facing slope of the ridge and the ground beginning to give up its frozen quality underfoot, Nora said at the kitchen table, "The ground will be decent enough in a few days." I looked up. "On the ridge," she said. I set down my cup. "I'll go whenever you're ready." She nodded. She picked up her coffee and didn't say anything else about it that night. We went up on a Thursday, the first day of April, in the morning. The ground was wet and the ridge grass was still pale from the winter, but there was green beginning to push through at the roots, the particular sharp green of new growth that appears in Wyoming when the season turns. The limestone broke clean and pale above us as we climbed. The grave was in a sheltered spot where the ridge bent north and a few old pines had grown up to break the wind. It was a small marker, a flat piece of limestone with the name and the dates cut into it simply, the way a person does when they do the work themselves and want it to last. Nora had cut it herself. I could tell by the evenness of the letters and the plain quality of the work. We stood there a moment. She did not cry. I had not expected her to. It was old grief, the kind that has been sat with long enough to become something you carry rather than something that takes you. But there was a quietness in her that was different from her usual quiet, and I respected it. After a while she said, "His name was James." "James," I said. "He was a good baby, easy. Didn't fuss." She looked at the marker. "The fever went fast. 1 week he was here and the next he wasn't." I stood beside her and said nothing, because nothing was what was needed. "I was angry for a long time," she said, "not about the child, about something larger. At a lot of things. At the man who left before James was born. At you for a different leaving. At the plane, I think, for just going on the way it does regardless." She looked out at the Wyoming morning, the pale sky and the new grass on the slope and the Sweetwater somewhere south of us with the spring in it. "I got over most of it." "Most," I said. She glanced at me sideways. "Most is honest," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was the shape one would take. I took her hand, just that. She did not pull away. We stood there on the ridge in the April morning above her son's grave, and I held her hand, and the plain spread out below us going slowly green after the long winter, and the pines made their small sound in the wind, and that was the truest moment of my life up to that point, and I have not had a truer one since. We were married in April, 3 weeks after we went up to the ridge. The circuit preacher came through on his regular swing, and Nora told him what she wanted, and he did it in the kitchen with Burl as witness, brief and plain, the way she wanted everything. She wore her good wool dress, and I had my cleanest shirt, and Burl wore his Sunday hat indoors, which was the most ceremony any of us were comfortable with. Afterward she made dinner and we ate at the kitchen table, and Burl had a small glass of rye whiskey, which he produced from somewhere, and which was the only evidence that he thought the occasion called for anything out of the ordinary. That night she got the tin box from the trunk in the main room and brought it to the kitchen table and set it between us and opened it. The letters were inside, all of them in the order they had arrived. She had numbered the envelopes in her own hand. There were 22 of them over 15 years. She had read them all. She had kept them all. She had numbered them. I looked at the box and then at her. "I kept them," she said, "because I didn't want to be the kind of woman who threw away something she might someday want back." I said, "I'm glad you're that kind of woman." She closed the box and set it back on the shelf above the mantel, next to her father's photograph, where it stayed. That spring we turned out 120 cattle onto the north pasture, and rebuilt the south fence line, and renegotiated the relay contract on better terms than the stage company had wanted to give, and cut hay in June from the south meadow that was the best cut the station had seen in years. Burls knee-held through the season. The horses were sound. I went to sleep every night in Nora Callum's house. Nora Drennan. She was now, though she kept Callum in the station's name because that was what it had always been called, and because her father had built it and she saw no reason to change it, which seemed right to me. And every morning I got up and went to work on a piece of ground that I had had no right to expect, that I had ridden 300 miles in the September of the previous year not certain I deserved, and that she had given me anyway because she was the kind of woman who read every letter and kept every one and was angry for a decade, and then came to the door and let a man sleep in the barn because she was not done with him yet. I have thought many times about what it cost her to do that. To open the door and let me in, not all the way and not at once, but step by step over the autumn and the winter and into the spring. Her trust given out in small, careful measures, the way you give water to a man who has been without it too long, a little at a time so as not to do damage. It cost her something real. I know that. She knew what I had been, and she watched me for 4 months before she said I could stay, and she never once pretended the 15 years hadn't happened, and she never once let me pretend it either. What she gave me was not forgiveness exactly. It was something harder and more honest than forgiveness. It was a second reckoning, the chance to stand in front of her as the man I was now and be seen clear, and found, if not innocent, at least worth the risk. I have tried every day since not to make her wrong about that. I have not always managed it perfectly. I told her I wouldn't, but I have managed it most days, and on the days I haven't she has looked at me with those gray eyes and told me plainly what she thinks, and I have listened, and we have gone on. That is the whole of it. The letters are in the tin box above the mantel still. 22 of them, 15 years of a man trying to hold onto the best thing he had ever known from 300 miles, and a life he was ashamed of. She kept every one. I think that is the truest thing I know about Nora Callum Drennan. She kept every one, and when I finally rode back to deserve them, she let me try.